In the last lecture module, we talked specifically about this strong epistemic component, this major epistemic project in Meditations on First Philosophy. We talked about the negative program of tearing down his knowledge edifice and the positive program of rebuilding his knowledge edifice anew in accordance with his newly discovered and affirmed epistemic principles. We talked about the nature of epistemology and skepticism, and we talked about how Descartes thought about the mind, its operations, the structure of his knowledge edifice, and his ability to form new beliefs or withhold his assent from judgments on the basis of evidence. In this module, we want to step back a bit and look at a broader historical context in which Descartes lives and writes the Meditations on First Philosophy. So while the project in the Meditations is a significant epistemic project, it is also a project with a social and a political agenda. Descartes wants to try and clear away some of the barriers to the scientific revolution that is posed by the more dogmatic and conservative but highly influential views of the scholastics. So we want to take a look at scholasticism, how scholastic methodology sought to understand the world, and then we want to contrast that with the development of the methodologies during the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Now, I realize that most students probably don't have a lot of familiarity with the Middle Ages, with scholasticism, perhaps even with the European Renaissance of the scientific revolution. So we'll talk to some degree about them. So in a way, Descartes' life and work provide a microcosm of the sorts of changes and challenges that are wrought by the important intellectual and economic developments that characterize this transition between the Middle Ages and the European Renaissance, and especially the scientific revolution. So it's important to understand his thinking and his work in this larger context and see how the historical trends motivate and inform his writing. So the medieval period of the Middle Ages is a European historical period that begins roughly at 500 AD with the fall of or collapse really, of the Western Roman Empire. This creates an enormous power vacuum and a great deal of instability. We see a decrease in artistic, cultural, and economic activity in these areas. There's a collapse of centralized authority in these areas. There doesn't get any reemergence of that kind of centralized state structure until perhaps Charlemagne around 800 AD. And so this is oftentimes or sometimes in the past talked of as the Dark Ages because it is this dramatic shift. There's a decrease in the European population as well as a decrease in population in urban centers. Additionally, a little bit later on, we see the emergence of a series of plagues, the most famous of which is the Black Plague. So this period extends then from 500 AD to roughly 1600 AD. And scholasticism itself is a movement that spans from about 1100 AD to about 1500 AD. Researchers generally divide scholastic philosophy into three philosophic periods, and it's usually known as the pre-scholastic or early scholastic period, the scholastic or high scholastic period, and the late scholastic period. The late scholastic period commonly refers to the time period from approximately 1350 to 1650, and it includes such figures as William of Ockham and Duns Scotus. Early or pre-scholastic period includes most notably St. Anselm and runs approximately from Anselm's birth around 1100 to around 1250. Classic or high scholasticism runs from 1250 to 1350, and this is sort of considered to be the intellectual high point of scholasticism. And it includes figures like the figure depicted in the slide here, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, as a movement, scholasticism really designates the interests, influences, and methodologies, primarily of educated religious figures. So universities began to be founded around the 1200s. But even when universities are founded, they're staffed primarily by clergy for much of that period. The dominant body of people who are educated, who have traveled, and so on, are wealthy figures and religious figures. And so scholasticism is a methodology that is geared around them. The development of universities is also geared around them as well. The subject matter in universities and schools consists of studying Latin translations, usually translations from Greek or Arabic into Latin, of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle's writings, of commentaries on his writings, and other miscellaneous closely related texts. There isn't a ton of intellectual diversity in this, in part because a great deal of the libraries and written materials had been destroyed with the collapse of the Roman Empire. One of scholasticism's main methodologies involves the analysis of existent scholarly opinions on a question or a set of questions, with the goal of creating clear lines of argumentation representing different opinions and exploring the contradictions between those opinions and the potential for reconciliation. So in this way, scholasticism is a very conservative methodology. It's a methodology that is related primarily to understanding the existing opinions and their relationship to each other and the potential for reconciliation. It doesn't really have a strong emphasis on the development of new opinions or of testing opinions, for instance, in light of experience. Now, beginning around the 14th century, we see the rise of what's called the European Renaissance. And it's really sort of located initially in the city of Florence in Tuscany, Italy. European Renaissance is characterized by an increase in commerce, artistic and religious activity, and it runs roughly from the 14th century through the 17th century. It brings a dramatic increase in the population, in the governmental and societal structures, but also in the economic, artistic, and scientific activities in these countries. And ultimately, it will lead to what historians call the scientific revolution. Now, historians generally associate the beginning of the scientific revolution with the publication of two important works. On the one hand, the fellow we have depicted in this slide is Nicholas Copernicus. And right around the time of his death in 1543, a German publishing firm in Nuremberg, Johannes Petrus, publishes this privately circulated manuscript of Copernicus's called Commentarius, or Little Commentary. And they published it under the title De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. And this book is intellectually important because it proposes an alternative cosmology to the existent cosmology. Namely, it suggests that we can better understand our observations of the movements of the heavenly bodies if, instead of supposing that the Earth is the center of the universe and that all things rotate around the Earth, we suppose that the Earth is not the center, but the Sun is the center of our solar system and we are rotating around the Sun. This is a radical view. It's radical not just in astronomical terms, but in terms of the way that it conceptualizes the role of humanity in the place of the Earth in the cosmos. Instead of being at the center of all creation, which is what you would expect in a sort of biblical depiction of the nature of the universe, the Earth becomes just one planet rotating around one sun in a much larger universe. And we'll pick this up in the next lecture module.